So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Carol Britt, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Institute on Aging at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Actually, I was reflecting, I think the first time we met was, I want to say spring of 2007, when Carol knew me just as a wee, tiny little postdoc presenting at one of the Midas investigator meetings. And that began a collaboration and foray into Midas for me. But so Dr. Ryff is a world-renowned expert in psychological well-being whose research focuses on social, structural, and cultural determinants of psychological well-being, as well as how psychological well-being is linked to biological, physiological, and neural processes implicated in physical health. Dr. Ryff is director and principal investigator of the National Institute on Aging-funded Midlife in the United States study, which began in 1995, and wave 3 and year 20-some-odd of data collection, as well as the parallel MIDJA, or Midlife in Japan study. Her publications have appeared in diverse and prestigious journals, including Psychosomatic Medicine, Health Psychology, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which, if you weren't around last night for her talk, her seminal paper on psychological well-being has been cited 10,851 times as about 12:45 this afternoon. Social Science and Medicine, Perspectives in Psychological Science, Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Brain Behavior and Immunity, JAMA Psychiatry, and Proceedings of the National Academy. It's wonderful to have Dr. Ryff share her research, particularly the value and contributions of the Midas study, and to talk to us today about rethinking human health, transformational advances from Midas.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Should I take it off? Yeah. Excuse me while I'm undressing here. I'm undressing my jewels. They're messing up the sound system. Hang on a minute, folks.
It's beautiful. I'm just asking you to take it off.
A little clanky, okay? There we go. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm having a really great time on this campus. Yesterday was wonderful. I got to meet so many incredible people. And today was wonderful. Javier just took me over to the choral performance and the Memorial Union. I mean, you've got a really cool campus here, and I'm delighted to partake of it. So what am I going to do? I'm going to start out with a big assertion that most health research is actually about disease, disability, and death. And that's not what health is. That's illness. So actually, the National Institute of Health is actually the National Institute of Disease. And the National Institute of Mental Health should actually be called NIMI because it's also the National Institute of Mental Illness. So I'm basically here to say that I think one of the great advances of the Midas study that I'll explain in more detail is actually studying health as health. By focusing on basically positive factors that nurture adaptive human functioning and maintenance of physiological systems as people age across the life course, even in the face of adversity. I think that's part of what makes the study transformational. And I just wanted to say that I think we are very simpatico. That is what you're doing here, what you're doing in this college, on this campus. I love, actually, the vision of this College of Public Health and Human Sciences. Its emphasis on lifelong health and well-being for every person, every family, every community. That's really so needed. It's so incredibly needed. Your focus on integrating education, research, practice, carrying it into the community to improve people's lives. And then there's a part on your mission statement about the values, the really wonderful values. And I think we should get values out there in more prominent ways, guiding the work that we're doing. So I only picked some that I'm really fond of in the work that I do, values of equity, care, and compassion, and continuous improvement. So basically, I hope we find some important common ground. I'm mostly going to talk with you about Midas. Some of you already use the MIDUS data. You know the study. Others of you may not know it. And what I decided to do in this presentation is to really go through a lot of findings without getting into the details of any of the studies. I just want to give you a flavor for how I think we are advancing this novel perspective on health as health by focusing on a lot of things that human developmentalists naturally see as core and critical and key. And we're bringing a lot of those things into the health arena. So it is about science for prevention, actually, positive health promotion and prevention. Human development is basically a key idea of all of this. Even though it's a study that was initiated with people aged 25 to 74 at the baseline, we actually have a lot of assessments of early life experience, retrospective assessments. And so we have a lot of people working with the data that use these indicators of many different aspects of childhood, early life experience, and link that to what's happening in adulthood thereafter. The overarching theme is multidisciplinary science, biopsychosocial integration. I think that's the way science for health, at least, has to go, because otherwise we end up with these very fragmented conceptions of the person. And a validation, I think, of the importance of the MIDUS study is the scientific community has come in droves to this data set, which to me says something about the kinds of data sets that many people would like to be working with to advance this perspective on health as health. So this is an old brochure. It's on our website, but it kind of, for those of you who've never really read or heard anything about the study, this is not a bad place to start. It tells you how the study got off the ground. It emerged from the MacArthur Midlife Research Network. That was 10 years of discussion and dialogue among a multidisciplinary team about how could we actually put our talents and areas of expertise together to try to develop this new approach to health. Big emphasis on factors that promote positive health and resilience over the life course, beginning with over 7,000 Americans aged 25 to 74, including a national sample of twins, which has become a unique asset to the study. We have deepened and grown the study over time, including expanding the samples. So we now have over 12,000 Americans in the study, many of whom have been studied for more than 20 years. The content is even bigger and broader than this, but this is a first window into the content. So one of the most important things about the MIDUS study, let me see if I can find the pointer here. No, is this it? Sorry, I got... Which button is the pointer? We lost the AV guy. Okay, so am I going? I can't point. This is called pointing. Let's do this kind of pointing. Okay, so here's the point I want to make. One of the great novelties of the study was to bring a lot of this stuff, which represents a lot of what psychologists, human developmentalists, individual difference variable people focus on. A lot of that stuff had never before been in a major population-based study. It's certainly not at a level where these things were being measured in ways that the people who have developed a lot of those constructs believe that they need to be measured. So one of the great advances, I think, of having psychologists and human developmentalists at the table was that we were bringing in a lot of what are now being construed as protective factors. And let me just say, this represents what happened at MIDUS 2. At MIDUS 1, it was just a survey study, a lot of self-report data. At MIDUS 2, we got serious about bringing in biology through clinic-based assessments on subsamples of people from the national sample, neuroscience assessments on subsamples of them as well. Big emphasis on what's happening in people's lives, stress exposures measured in lots of different ways. And the part that I would say the kind of individual difference researchers usually tend to not pay much attention to because they don't have the samples that would allow them to do that is this stuff up here, the sociodemographic factors. You have to actually have representative samples, heterogeneous samples of U.S. adults to actually take that stuff seriously, which I do. The data are publicly available. The website is chock full of information. So many people are using the data, which is really great because it costs a lot of money to collect this data. And so one of the ways in which we make the case to the funding agencies that, you know, this study is worth funding, even though it's very expensive, is that it gets so much usage from the scientific community. This is the number of publications to date. And now we see, and I know some of this is happening here too, graduate students all over the country are actually using this data set for doctoral research, for master's thesis research. This book just came out. It's a really, I think, valuable, in-depth overview. There are 35 chapters in the book. To write a chapter in the book, you had to have been working in an area where you had contributed 4 to 5 or more publications. And so the point of the chapter is to kind of weave a narrative around targeted areas of work within the study, all built around this theme of multidisciplinary integrative research. So this is where I'm going to shift to basically give you a flavor of some of the science that is coming out of MIDUS that I think reflects this transformational approach to health. So thinking about the role of positive psychosocial factors, well-being is near and dear to my heart. I'll say a little bit about that, but we also have great assessments of sense of control, really rich assessments of the quality of people's social ties, many varieties of their social ties. Personality traits are getting a lot of emphasis in the study, I think in new ways. All of these things are pointing to the health benefits that are linked with these positive psychosocial factors. I'm very interested, and a lot of other people are too, in the role of these psychosocial factors as buffers in the face of challenges of socioeconomic adversity or disadvantage. But we don't ignore negative factors in MIDUS, including at the psychological and social levels. So I'll say some things about some areas that I think represent innovation in terms of how we go after negative biopsychosocial processes. So for those of you who heard my talk yesterday, I'm not going to go into as much detail about this model of well-being that I developed some years ago. But what I'm going to draw attention to, again, pointing is purpose in life has gotten a lot of attention as a new influence on morbidity, mortality, physiological functioning, brain-based functioning, in a way that I think we could not have predicted. And so I'm going to give you a flavor for these ideas and of purposeful life engagement, being protective of good health. And I just want to underscore that the first person who gave us a clue that this might be the case was Viktor Frankl. Man's search for meaning, 3 years. He's a psychiatrist, 3 years in a Nazi concentration camp. He's the guy who articulates this incredible perspective on the life-saving force of purpose and meaning in the most horrible of horrible circumstances, which is really what his book, Man's Search for Meaning, is about. And for that reason, I think it's about time that we got serious in going after purpose in life in health research, not just in clinical intervention. So I'm going to show you a lot of slides like this, where the punchline is at the top, the journal is at the bottom. Midas is a great place where you can search for articles. There are PDFs of all of these articles on the website, and you can search by author's surname. That's the fastest way to get. So anything you're interested in here, and I'm happy to send this file to anybody who wants to come back to it and dig into certain areas, because I'm going to show you a lot of slides that look like this. So this was a publication from Midas showing that purpose in life predicts, after adjusting for all of the relevant covariates, reduced risk of mortality across adulthood. And several other studies, longitudinal studies, had already gotten on board with showing the link between purpose in life and reduced risk of mortality. And those in 2016, many of those studies were pulled together in this meta-analysis involving more than 136,000 people, and basically saying, you know, there's a real story here that higher purpose in life predicts reduced risk for not only mortality, all-cause mortality, but also reduced risk for cardiovascular events. Purpose in life also predicts lower levels of allostatic load, this summary index of physiological wear and tear on different bodily systems. In the health and retirement study, also funded by the National Institute on Aging, also population-based longitudinal evidence. Eric Kim is the big go-getter here, graduate student from University of Michigan, subsequently became a postdoc in the Chan School of Public Health at Harvard, and he's just so productive. So he used the purpose in life assessments in HRS based on my model to show reduced risk of myocardial infarction among adults with coronary heart disease, reduced risk of stroke. Importantly, purpose in life is predictive of more preventive health behaviors like cholesterol tests, cancer screenings, and a more recent publication, and this is all prospective. Purpose in life predicts reduced risk of physical impairment. Okay, so this is where we're shifting to looking at the components of well-being as not just purpose in life, but all of the components of well-being. And so one of the things that we were very interested in looking at once we had longitudinal data is, you know, are there increases, decreases in these aspects of well-being across the first longitudinal follow-up, 9 to 10 years? And actually, there's a lot of stability. There's a lot of stability in well-being. And, you know, people who get trained to think with developmental kinds of questions, but it's always, there's a preoccupation with change. Like, change is the only place where interesting stuff is happening. And I don't think that's true. I think actually stability is incredibly interesting because there are varieties of stability. So when it comes to well-being, some people can be persistently low in their profiles of well-being across these different dimensions. Other people can kind of be persistently in the middle range. Fewer people are increasing or decreasing, and then there are some people who are persistently high. So this is just a study where we take advantage of that fact to show that persistently high well-being across these different dimensions predicts prospectively better lipid profiles after adjusting for a lot of factors. Just a flavor for some of the work that is linking eudaimonic well-being to the neuroscience project in the Midas study. So this is a part of the neuroscience project where People are in the neuroimaging magnet, and they're being exposed to positive stimuli. And the focus is on what that means in terms of reward circuitry in the brain, measured in the ventral striatum area of the brain. And so what they find, because they're tracking these things carefully in time and in this experimental context, they're finding that those who show sustained engagement of reward circuitry in the brain in response to positive stimuli are people who are reporting high levels of eudaimonic well-being as a composite. And those same people also show reduced cortisol output over the course of the day. They have better diurnal profiles of salivary cortisol measured 4 times a day over 4 days. This is the finding that's basically showing sustained activation of the ventral striatum being linked with higher levels of well-being measured as a composite. And this is a graphic of linking that sustained ventral striatum activity to reduced cortisol output over the course of the day. This is not MIDUS data, but we are now doing gene expression in the MIDUS study. Steve Cole has joined us as a co-investigator. He's the guy who's come up with this conserved transcriptional response to adversity. It's so interesting because it shows these dramatically different patterns linking hedonic versus eudaimonic well-being to upregulation. Well, the background point here is this pattern of gene expression is relevant for inflammatory processes and antibody processes. It's that kind of gene expression. And so the first findings that got a lot of critical commentary actually showed that those with higher levels of hedonia showed upregulation of pro-inflammatory genes and downregulation of, oh my God, now I'm undressing. What next? There might be a striptease coming. Okay, so forgive me. Higher hedonia was predictive of the less healthy profile, that is, upregulation of pro-inflammatory genes and downregulation of antibody synthesis genes, whereas higher eudaimonia showed the opposite, healthy pattern. And people got really exercised about these findings. There was a lot of just blasting this article in the empirical literature. They then replicated the findings, and then they replicated the findings again. So this is an interesting area of work in which we now actually have data on gene expression in MIDUS, data that Steve Cole has just processed for us. We don't have it publicly available, but I'm hoping we will by May or June of this year. Okay, so enough on basically hedonia, eudaimonia, well-being, Carol's interest in all of this. We have a lot of other really great measures of good psychological things. This is work by Julia Boehm showing basically that optimism predicts healthier lipid profiles as well. And lots of these studies are kind of trying to dig in more deeply. What are mediating processes? Partly explained by better health behaviors and lower body mass index. Another publication by this group, Optimism, also predicts higher levels of a good biomarker, higher serum antioxidants, and those effects are partly explained by diet and smoking. Health measured in terms of incident cardio conditions, cardiometabolic risk, 8 to 11 years later. Okay, so this is shifting a little bit. It's to the social relational ends of people's strengths and resources and connecting it to adult cognition, which is, thanks to Margie Lockman, something that we have really great assessments on in the MIDUS study. So people with positive relationship histories, so you're measuring these social relational factors longitudinally across time, they show better executive function and better episodic memory. Another angle on relational quality that this group has gone after is the people's reports about the extent to which they perceive that their partner is responsive to them. And perceived partner responsiveness in this study is linked with better sleep efficiency, measured in terms of the ActiWatch. So people who are in the biomarker project go home from the clinic with the ActiWatch, which is movement sensitive. It's been validated against polysomnography studies. And so it provides objective assessments of things like sleep duration, sleep efficiency. And so this is basically showing that people who are reporting higher levels of partner responsiveness show better sleep efficiency, and that works through having lower levels of anxiety. Control beliefs and social support and exercise. So Margie Lockman kind of created a composite of protective resources in this study, and she linked those things to less subsequent decline in functional health, exploiting the longitudinal data. Those same things, also control beliefs, social support, and exercise, also predict better cognitive performance. This is a protective composite that is moderated by educational differences in memory. Margie also went after computer use to show that people who are frequent users of computers show better executive functioning, that of confounds, including cognitive ability. And here we have Rob Stosky turning up, among others, using the diary. So Dave Almeida, at the baseline of the MIDUS study, collected daily diary data from a subsample of the MIDUS respondents. That daily diary project has been continued through time. And along the way, we also brought assessments of salivary cortisol, again, measured 4 times a day across multiple days. So this is basically linking positive daily events, which was an innovation in the diary project. Let's not just use our assessments of life experience to go after the bad stuff. Let's actually measure some positive stuff as well. So positive daily experiences predicted better diurnal cortisol, a steeper slope, controlling for daily stressors and daily affect. And then just a couple studies that push more deeply into the question of, are these benefits evident even in the face of inequality? This is a wonderful paper by Greg Miller and colleagues. So it goes back to our efforts to get a handle on childhood poverty among the MIDUS participants, measured in terms of parents' educational status when they were children growing up, whether the family had financial strain, whether they were receiving like welfare support. So you have some kind of indicator of childhood poverty, and not surprisingly, that becomes predictive of a higher prevalence of metabolic syndrome in adult life, but not among those who had highly nurturing mothers. So you have highly nurturing mothers serving as a moderator, a protective buffer against this adverse health outcome that is linked with childhood poverty. This is work with Jen Morozink Boylan, is her name now. We use the model of well-being, basically, first of all, to replicate previous findings. This is about the reality, as demonstrated in multiple studies, that people with lower levels of educational attainment on average show elevated levels of the inflammatory marker interleukin-6 that is implicated in a lot of disease endpoints. And this is basically a study that shows among those with only a high school education or less, those who have high levels of well-being, and those people exist, have profiles of IL-6 that look more like college-educated people than people who are from their own educational subgroup. This is a study showing that life satisfaction protects against diurnal cortisol dysregulation that is driven by low socioeconomic status. Perceived control in this study serves as a buffer against the adverse effect of low socioeconomic status on cortisol dysregulation. And then here's one of an emerging group of studies that actually go after conscientiousness. Conscientiousness has become, so the big 5-factor model of personality traits that those of us who grow up in fields of psychology and human development, we all know what those traits are. We all know they've been studied endlessly. As it turns out, conscientiousness is emerging as a really important protective factor in a lot of this more, let's call it epidemiologically based research. It buffers against and neuroticism, alternatively amplifies inflammatory risk measured in terms of interleukin-6 and CRP that is associated with low socioeconomic status, and these effects are partly working through central adiposity. This is work that Elliot Friedman and I did together. So if you teach classes on aging and you're helping your students understand normal aging, normal aging is a tale in which if you live long enough, you're going to have chronic conditions. They're just going to crop up. Comorbidity is the other word for that, that if you live long enough, that means that's just biological aging. And fortunately, you're not dead, but you might have some other, things you have to deal with. Those chronic conditions, this is how all of these things have, I think, like bidirectional relationships. Those chronic conditions can fuel further inflammatory processes that increase your risk for having other health problems. And so this is basically first showing that those with higher profiles of comorbidity among older members of the sample have elevated levels of IL-6 and CRP, but not among older adults who have high comorbidity and high well-being. Okay, so if you go to the homepage on the website and you click on publications under the tab for researchers, this table comes up without the numbers because they're always changing. But if you click on any one of these topic areas, you get the number of publications, and then you get a list of all those publications with the PDFs. So this is a great place to get a quick handle on who's doing what with this data set and what's already been published. So, of course, there are other factors that compromise health, smoking, pernicious biopsychosocial pathways. I just want to draw attention to the fact that I think one of the great innovations of MIDUS are multidimensional assessments of anger. Anger is a part of a lot of contemporary life on planet Earth that I think is tied to all kinds of things, the refugee problem, inequality, and so on. You want to read more about this. You want to get a really big scholarly overview about anger from a historical perspective. Read a book called Age of Anger, A History of the Present. I don't have it in my slides here, but I'm happy to send a link to this. The author is a guy from India, Pankaj Mishra. It's a spectacular book of deep scholarship about what well, first of all, the history of anger at different pivotal points in human history. So, for example, during the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, there's a lot of anger that's, happening during those periods because life has become so unacceptable for some individuals. But he is linking all of this to our more current conditions. And so what does that have to do with Midas? We decided to bring into the study several dimensions of anger. So we measure anger expression, anger suppression, anger control, and I think there's a couple others, and I can't remember what they are. Trait anger, yeah, that would be like, this is who you are regularly. And I think these are really important factors to be, and let me just say, all of this complexity, people can actually have high well-being and they can also be angry. And we are not very good at figuring out how to put those combinations together. This doesn't have well-being in it, but it does show that members of the sample with high trait anger profiles, high anger expression, had amplified risk for elevated inflammation among the less educated. And this effect, by the way, doesn't actually happen in Japan. I don't have a slide about this, but let me just give you the quick story about if you live in an interdependent culture, a collectivist culture like Japan, anger's not okay because it disrupts social harmony. But if you are high status, you can get away with it. You can be angry and you can even be obnoxious. And there are some, really well-known examples in the media. Some daughter of a Toyota Scion blew up at some airline stewardess on a plane. Some of you remember this. She didn't like the nuts that were being served. She was one, but she didn't like what she was getting. Anyway, yeah, it doesn't work this way in Japan. It's actually it is not, you don't see high expressions of anger among low status people. You see it more among high status people, and it doesn't look like there's concomitants of it that would suggest biological risk. Race differences in the interplay. This is really, I think, so important and interesting. It's basically showing if we bring the same kind of questions to the analysis, but we focus on educational status among Blacks, what we find is that high levels of anger predicted elevated inflammation among the better educated, not the less educated. And we're learning from other folks who work on race and health in America that there's growing concern about the fact that advances in educational attainment for Blacks may not be translating to the same kind of health benefits that have been observed for whites. And the discussion of this paper goes into some of those issues. Perceived discrimination gets a lot of attention in the MIDUS study, thanks to David Williams, who brought the measure of perceived discrimination into the MIDUS study. It measures discrimination in terms of major events, like you've been denied a promotion or a bank loan, or housing, or everyday things like you're not treated with respect. And the first publication that David Williams and Ron Kessler and some others generated with the baseline perceived discrimination measure showed that about a third of the people in the national sample perceived they're discriminated against. It's not just for reasons of race, because we ask about the attribution for it. So people perceive they're discriminated against on the basis of their age, their gender, their educational status, their weight, their sexual orientation. I mean, it's a really interesting measure. And when we link, for example, Vera Sinkova has a wonderful paper showing, she's kind of become our expert on glycemic regulation, measuring levels of glycosylated hemoglobin. People with higher body mass index have higher levels of HbA1c, and if they also have higher body mass index and they perceive they are discriminated against on the basis of their weight, their levels are even higher. Adult smokers have higher extroversion and neuroticism and lower conscientiousness than non-smokers. This is where this guy from Finland is doing a lot of integrative analyses, across cohort studies. Low attentional control, measured in terms of executive function, predicts higher risk of type 2 diabetes via higher anxious arousal and higher levels of interleukin 6. A couple weeks ago, I was at the International Congress of Behavioral Medicine in Santiago, Chile. And because it was the behavioral medicine meetings, I made an effort to try to get my arms around some of the additional research coming out of MIDUS having to do with health behaviors like eating, diet, nutrition, exercise, physical activity, and sleep. This is a publication from the MIDJA MIDUS comparison study. So we have these assessments of constructs that are bread and butter ideas in cultural psychology, measuring levels of independence versus interdependence, which are really handles on self-construal and the extent to which you define yourself largely separately as a function of who you are versus you define yourself as embedded in these connections with other people. This is just saying that independence, which is the kind of prized quality in U.S. culture, predicts healthy eating, whereas in Japan, high levels of interdependence predict healthy eating. And we don't have particularly great measures of healthy eating here, but this was the best we could do. Vera Sinkova has gone after our assessments of do you eat when you're stressed, to basically show that stress eating predicts worse glucose metabolism among non-diabetic adults. These are how glucose metabolism is measured, and central fat distribution is a mediator in these findings. And really interesting stuff is being done on sleep in the study as relates to racial inequalities in health. So these findings make use of the fact that at MIDUS 2, we recruited a sample of about 600 African Americans from Milwaukee to the study. And the reason we had members of the national sample who were African Americans, but we really wanted to bring as many African Americans as possible into the biomarker and neuroscience projects. And so we chose to bring people who were in close proximity to Madison so that they could participate in the biomarker project. And these are publications making great use of that data. So the first finding that came out in 2017 shows, again, using actigraphy, that African Americans had poorer sleep measured in terms of less duration, lower efficiency compared to European Americans, and race differences in cardiometabolic risk were partially explained by sleep time and efficiency. And then digging in more deeply, how do we think about unpacking some of these racial differences in sleep? Tom Fuller-Rolls leading a lot of this work, and the FAR publication goes after neighborhood disadvantage, operationalized in terms of neighborhood income levels, poverty rate, public assistance, educational levels, to find that neighborhood disadvantage mediated racial differences in waking after sleep onset. This study brings in perceived discrimination that predicts higher levels of sleep difficulty and discrimination attenuated the difference between sleep between whites and non-whites. Okay, so physical activity, we're educated people. We know physical activity is important. That doesn't always mean we do it, we get it done, but we know it is important. I think there is a level at which it's a kind of known thing, I would say. I don't know the science on this, but to me it seems like it's part of health literacy across educational groups, that it's important to get exercise. But guess what? Some people might say, well, I get a lot of exercise in my job. My job is physical. I have to do a lot of physical things in my job. And this is a great study that Vera worked on, and then other people have come after this. And so we use the assessments in MIDUS to make distinctions between what's called leisure time physical activity, where you're running or hiking or you go to a health club, versus occupational physical activity. You do a lot of heavy lifting in your job, or household physical activity. And that's not just women's work. I mean, it could be housekeeping, but it could be yard work. But it's stuff you do to take care of your. And this finding basically showed that leisure time physical activity was linked with insulin resistance, whereas there were no effects for these other kinds of physical activity. So I think this is really calling for more carefully formulated assessments of physical activity as relates to social class. Continuing along these lines, this is a study linking childhood socioeconomic disadvantage to profiles of physical activity and diabetes in adulthood. Childhood socioeconomic disadvantage predicts reduced odds that you would actually be doing this leisure time physical activity, and higher odds of prediabetes and diabetes, but similar patterns are not observed for occupational or household physical activity. And there are gender differences in these patterns as well. Chun Lee, now at UC Riverside, basically shows that for women, low socioeconomic status seems to map subsequently onto getting less leisure time physical activity in adulthood, where for men, lower socioeconomic status seems to happen on a pathway leading to poor diet, poor eating habits. And these factors partially account for the links between childhood disadvantage and metabolic syndrome in adulthood. I'm just about done. For those of you who get tired of how Carol races through her talks, she wants to cover too much material. This is just for those of you who want a flavor for how the design is set up. So on the top, we have the core sample being tracked through time. You can see at M1, there was only the survey and the diary assessment. That's MacArthur funded. NIA steps up at MIDUS 2, and that's when we break out multiple projects. So we have the survey, we have a cognitive project, a diary project, a biomarker project, a neuroscience project, and Milwaukee. We have now collected the M3 survey cognitive and Milwaukee survey and cognitive data. The red stuff is what we're in the field doing right now. But this was the first PL1, this was the second PL1, and now we have a U19 over here. But at the time of the second PL1, we refreshed the sample. That is what's called the Midas Refresher, where we actually pretty much replicated the size and age and gender distribution of the baseline sample and then did all of the same projects. For many reasons. One is to increase the size of like the biomarker project so people could do more in-depth analysis, but a huge reason for going after the refresher was related to historical change, namely the impact of the economic recession. Period effects. Those of us who grow up in, worlds of lifespan developmental thinking, models about age, period, and cohort, we knew something really important was happening here historically, and we wanted to go after it. And this relates to, Case and Deaton published an important article recently about their good demographers about increase in deaths of despair. And Javier tells me this morning that we have even higher levels of death today, right? Is that
third year in a row?
Third year in a row. Yeah. So we're seeing at the population level, we're seeing higher levels of mortality. And Case and Deaton's point was this seems to be mortality related to suicide, drinking, hence the term deaths of despair. And Noreen Goldman, Dana Gley, and Max Weinstein just recently published this paper in the PNAS to kind of build on those findings, because the Case and Deaton data didn't really actually have mental health assessments in the data. We have those in spades in MIDUS. And so this is basically a comparison between the MIDUS baseline sample and the refresher sample. And the finding is, in fact, one of greater distress and less well-being, measuring both the negative things and the positive things. But this is happening among low socioeconomic status adults in the refresher compared to the main sample. And the Case and Deaton findings, I forgot to emphasize, are findings that really push on these increased profiles of deaths of despair among working class whites in the U.S. So we also have a paper currently in review now, an American psychologist paper that's kind of an overview of MIDUS contributions to the research on inequality, underscoring that the MIDUS study has brought a lot of psychosocial and behavioral factors into our understanding of pathways of inequality. But our main point in this article is to say, and guess what? It looks like the tail on inequality is getting worse. We are becoming a more unequal society than we have ever been, and we look notably worse than other European countries where we used to look more comparable. So there are things happening in this country, in this culture right now that should concern all of us. And we need to be doing, I think, really great science to document that. So the article that we hope gets accepted is basically summarizing some of the pre-recession inequality findings and arguing for a new round of post-recession inequality findings to really empirically assess, are inequalities getting worse in American society? Because the opioid addiction is kind of embedded in some of the Case and Deaton discussion and findings, I just think this is a really interesting paper published in Addictive Behaviors, showing clever use of the MIDUS data, underscoring that one hallmark of drug addiction is a focus on the present rather than the future. So here they showed that those scoring lower on future thinking, that was linked with longer duration smoking and also with higher levels of norepinephrine. Smoking mediated the association between future thinking and norepinephrine. This is linking daily stress and cortisol output. Oh, coming back to the positive, it's basically saying those linkages are attenuated on days in which people volunteer. That's such an important message coming out of this study, particularly as it relates to older people in the sample. There truly are health benefits that are being documented for, like, caring about your community. Do something in your community. And we're basically showing it's probably, we don't know what it's doing for your community. We hope it's doing some good, but it's also doing incredible good for the people who are doing the volunteering. Okay, this is the finale. There's a lot going on in MIDUS. I think a lot of the evidence is demonstrating the health protective benefits of psychosocial resources and strengths, sometimes even in the context of adversity. We're making headway, we collectively, in explicating the behavioral and neurobiological pathways. You know from my talk yesterday, I don't think this study is perfect. I think there are things we're not doing. It troubles me greatly that we don't know much of anything about people's participation in encounters with active production of creative things, so encounters with the arts. And then I would say, going back to your mission, and reading your mission made me think about this, is how can we take this emerging body of science and knowledge in new directions related to research translation and community interventions. And so the focus here on community outreach and translation, I think, is wonderful. And we need to find richer and better ways, I think, to build connections between some of the things that are coming out of the science and what that might mean in terms of community interventions. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Yeah.
The effects of like different types of physical activity.
Yeah.
Like insulin response and
Yeah.
diabetes. Do you think it's more to do with like the setting change or like the mind frame shift between like leisure activity versus?
I think it's actually, I don't know for sure, but my hunch is it's actually to do with, you know, the importance of aerobic. I mean, I think it's what does the kind of leisure activity that most of us pursue, what does it do? It's not for the, maybe some people do isometrics, but for the most part, we're doing exercise that is actually activating our aerobic system, our breathing system. And so I think the difference between that and having a job where you just have to lift a lot of heavy things all the time is back-breaking work. It's probably not doing much for your aerobic capacity. So I don't know. I mean, I would go down that road, but I'm not an exercise researcher. Okay, I think I'm scheduled to meet with a few folks here now, so I'm going to do that.
Thank you very much.